Hello and welcome to Pods Like Us. I'm Martin Quibell, known to my friends as Marv. This time I'm joined by a man who is an acclaimed writer, a journalist, critic and a podcaster. My guest has worked for the High Fidelity and Keynote magazines, as well as the New York Times and the New York Observer. He is also one of three main hosts on the Beatles-related podcast, Things We Said Today, and has written books that include Misha Elman and the Romantic Style, Classical Music, A Critic's Guide to the 100 Most Important Recordings. I don't know how you could have picked just 100. And a recent book that I absolutely love, the McCartney Legacy, which he co-wrote with Adrian Sinclair. My guest is a man who somehow finds the time to do all of these things, Mr. Allan Kozinn. Allan, thank you for speaking with me today.
My pleasure, Martin.
Thank you. So you passed your bachelor's degrees in music and journalism from Syracuse University in 1976. And then was it a slow build from there then to the career in working journalism and critic and becoming a writer?
It actually wasn't that slow. It probably felt slow at the time. When I was still at Syracuse, I was writing for basically what is the equivalent of the Village Voice up there, called the Syracuse New Times. Yep. And there was also an Ithaca New Times and a Buffalo New Times. So some of my stuff turned up in those places too. Some of my stuff turned up only in those places. I'd go to one of those other cities and review a concert or something. So by the time I got out of school, I had a portfolio of articles and reviews, and just started freelancing for the Times initially, and for a lot of other places. And the Times published its first piece of mine in 1977, so that was about a year after I graduated. And that was pretty steady. And opened a lot of other doors, because once you are writing pretty regularly for the Times, it's easy to get other people to take your stuff. So, and then I eventually went on staff at the Times and was there till 2014, when I retired and moved up to Maine. But I still do some things for them and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and other things in between chapters of these books.
So when you were doing the degrees in music and journalism, was your intention to actually go into being a music journalist, or were you just edging your bets and going to do the music and the journalism and see which one stuck?
Well, it was like this. I mean, I wanted to go to school and get a music degree, and my parents wanted me to become a lawyer. Okay. And felt that a journalism degree would be an easier thing to get into law school with than a music degree. So I guess they felt, I'm not sure on what basis, but they felt I was a reasonably good writer. So I went to journalism school as well, and tried to put together a dual degree, which they didn't have. So I ended up with a ridiculous amount of credit hours. I actually could have a master's in one of them, but they had to be simultaneous, because my offer to get the music bachelor's degree and then get a master's in journalism, my parents felt that I probably wouldn't follow through with the journalism degree, and they were probably right. So I guess I thought that if I couldn't do anything in music, which it turns out I never really tried much to do once I got out, that I could do music journalism, and since I was already doing it when I was in school, it just seemed a natural thing to continue once I got out, rather than trying to give concerts and compose. I mean, one of the things you could see the second you get out of school is that composers are not very well treated and not very well paid. And you end up just being an academic and also writing, in your spare time or something, I didn't really want to do. I thought if I had to write music in my spare time, I might as well do music journalism, which I enjoyed doing as well. And that would be my main career. And the other stuff would be when I had the time.
Well, it would certainly help to mix the two together if your journalism, your main journalistic points would be on the music world. So things like when you were looking at classical music pieces, for instance, which I know that you were very important. That was one of your main jobs was to look at classical works. Hence the book that I mentioned, the Classical Music: A Critic's Guide to the 100 Most Important Recordings. I still don't know how you can pick 100 out of so many, but we'll leave that for now.
That was just the assignment to write that book was that was published by the Times, actually, that book.
But the theory that you learned during the degree and all of those things, that would be important when you go into looking at classical music and looking into the little bits of what each instrument is playing and how the arrangements are arranged for each individual instrument. And then people that don't listen to a lot of classical music might not realize that there are variations therein where different instruments can play different parts. It's interesting because you can hear like not an orchestra as such, but some alternatives. It's a bit like a Steve Reich piece can be done with so many instruments. I mean, I love the piece when he did with the different percussion and the different, the vibraphones, and he had that, for instance. But these parts can be played on different instruments. And if you play them on different instruments, there's a completely different feel to the music. So your theory knowledge and music knowledge and would actually help with your listening and discussing this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that was the idea. I mean, these days you can get a degree in various aspects of pop music, but in those days you couldn't. It was all classical music, and so that's what I studied. And at the Times, I was really a classical music critic, but because I had this little sort of side collecting specialty in the Beatles, at one point, the Times pop critic reviewed a video, which he took to be a live video. It was basically around the Beatles, which they put out as Ready Steady Go special edition, which it was never really on Ready Steady Go. But anyway, it turns out that they recorded the music sort of live in the studio the day before, and then they lip synced to it when they did the film. And there are some places where you can hear Paul singing live against the recorded vocal. The reviewer, just mentioned that it was a live recording, and I sent him a note saying, it's actually not live. This is what happened, and told him what I just told you. And he said, I knew there was something wrong with that. It wasn't, absolutely live. But a few months later, the first Beatles CDs came out, and he called me up and said, why don't you review the CDs? I'll just do a piece announcing that they're coming, and you review it, and you do your whole, mania thing about, mono and stereo mixes, whatever you want to do. And that's when I basically became the Beatles desk at the New York Times. And that critic, John Pareles, actually, a few years later, did a talk in a class at the Juilliard School. And he said, the New York Times is the only newspaper in the country that has a dedicated Beatles desk, and it's in the classical music department. So that's where we are. But, I did feel that that it would be important, if I was going to be writing about music, to have a music degree. You run into an awful lot of people who are just sort of guessing or going by feel or whatever it is. Although, you know, at the times, most of the other classical critics had studied music at a college level, and you know, some had degrees, some didn't, but they had studied it very seriously. And you kind of have to, because especially with classical music, if you make a mistake or say something ridiculous, you will hear about it immediately from the
Yeah.
readers.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's just something that's necessary. Although strangely enough, when I got to the Times, I mean, I'd been writing for the Times for a while. I was never able to get them to even look at my resume. So they didn't care particularly what degrees I had. And it was only when they finally put me on staff that they said, oh, by the way, could we have a resume for our files? So I'd been sending them these resumes all in the beginning of my freelance career that all went, I guess, directly in the trash. And now they needed one when I went on staff. So I supplied that. But you know what you're saying about having the 2 degrees is it was very helpful, because you know how journalism works, you know, from that side of that degree, and you know how music works from that degree. So the 2 fit together really naturally.
Absolutely. So what, I mean, what sort of, obviously impetus to that. So from there then, in 1980, was it 82 when you wrote the first book on Misha Elman?
Actually, I wrote a book before that called The Guitar, the
Yes.
Players, the History, and the Music, or they might not have been in that order, with 3 other guys. And I wrote the classical chapter, and they wrote jazz, rock, country, western, or something. So that was first, and that was about 1980. Then the biography of Misha Elman, and I felt that there wasn't probably enough interest in Misha Elman himself as a violinist, that I should really do the whole romantic violin style, which he was a representative of, one of the last representatives of. So I did that in, I guess, yeah, 82, whenever it came out, so long ago. And what did you ask about it?
So I was going to ask, so how did you, was that something that you'd intended on doing
No, that
originally,
was
becoming a writer, or was it just something that suddenly came on your plate as, oh, would you like to have a go at this?
in the case of the Misha Elman book, it was that, and I guess in the guitar book as well. The guy who was putting the book together, a writer named Gene Santoro, who was a great jazz critic and pop critic, and who died just in this past year, and was a close friend of mine. But we got to be friends on that book. He put the book together, and he called, and we had lunch, and he asked me if I would do the classical section with Misha Elman. The Elman family wanted to commission a bio.
Yep.
And I went and talked to them, and I didn't particularly want to be commissioned by the family. I wanted, you know, if I was going to write, it would have to be an independent thing.
Yep.
So I did an outline in the sample chapter and said, okay, now it's up to you guys to hire an agent and sell this. And I think they hired an agent, but they didn't have any luck selling it. So I thought, okay, then that's that. And then they worked out this deal where, well, how about if, you know, we pay you in advance, and if we sell the book eventually, then you pay us back the advance, and, you know, you work it out with the publisher. So I ended up writing that book. And they never found a publisher. But I was having dinner with someone at a publishing house, and he said, if, you know, if you got, it was just a social dinner, it wasn't to, you know, sell any books. And he said, have you done any books? And I said, well, you know, I have one about Misha Elman sitting in my closet in a box, you know. And he said, you mind if I look at it? And I gave it to him, and it turned out the publisher, the, you know, publisher person at the head of the company had seen Misha Elman play, and was a fan of his, and so they put the book out. So that was the second one. And I've done 8 altogether now, one of which I ghosted for someone. Basically, it was an artist manager, a classical music artist manager. And then the New York Times 100 best classical music recordings, that was, they had a series of 100 of this, 100 of that. So there's 100 films, 100 opera recordings, 100 jazz recordings. So I did that one. At the end of the book, there's a section where you can have like a list of 100 like also rans. So I have them at the end. So it's really 200 in that book. But even that, as you say, is pretty constricting. It's a huge record world out there, and many more than 100 that you would want. But anyway, there you go.
You know, really, the 100 most important recordings, classical wise, you would have the same argument with people if they were to say, oh, what are the 10 greatest albums by Miles Davis? And you ask 100 different people, they will give you a different list of that even. So
Yeah.
it's all your own specific opinion. Essentially, you've picked those 100 yourself, have you? Or is it from a group of critics and then you
No,
from there?
I picked them, and it was a partly what I felt really were the 100 pieces that everybody should know, and then within that, which recordings of each of those pieces, and and in the course of it, each chapter, each entry, basically makes the argument for why I'm choosing that recording of, like, if it's Beethoven symphonies, like how many hundreds of recordings of Beethoven symphonies, why I'm choosing this one. And probably also mentioned, but I also like this, and this one, because they're so different, even though they're the same piece. But, yeah, that was my choice, and there wasn't any editorial interference in it, so that was pretty good, and it was fun to do. And since it was the Times doing it, commissioning it, it kind of gave me the freedom to say, if I wanted to have a light reviewing week, is, well, I've got to work on the book this week, and it's your book, so got to do it. So that was very handy.
It's a bit like I have a preference towards I really love pieces by Rachmaninoff where he's actually performed them himself on the recordings, because there's a certain emotion that he puts into it because he's the actual creator of the pieces.
Mhm.
I mean, to a lot of people, they might not hear it essentially, but I can feel more of an emotion behind the piece when he's played the piece on the piano to another pianist playing those pieces.
Sure. And there's another interesting thing that happens with composer recordings of their own works, which is that they have no compunction whatsoever about completely reversing their own dynamic markings or anything else. So, the passage in the printed score might say forte, and Rachmaninoff might play it pianissimo. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but you run into that a lot. And in fact, in the case of Mahler, Mahler always said that his favorite recordings, his favorite conductor of his music was Mengelberg, the Dutch conductor.
Yeah.
You listen to Mengelberg's recordings, I think on the Fourth Symphony. I noted, like, on the first page of the symphony, there were something like 30 places where Mengelberg went a different way than Mahler's own markings, and he was Mahler's favorite conductor. And so, if just some pianist out there were to play Rachmaninoff concertos and decide to do all those same things, you would say, well, what's the point of having the score and all those markings if you're just going to ignore them? And yet Rachmaninoff himself did. So, and you can't really criticize Rachmaninoff interpreting his own music how he wants it to be, even though it may go against the printed score. So you run into a lot of interesting things like that once you start doing comparative listening of different recordings, and that was sort of the point of that book.
Well, people doing versions of classical pieces, we won't even get started on the fact that Copeland absolutely loathed Emerson, Lake and Palmer doing his material.
That's right. When I was at Syracuse, he came up and gave a talk, and someone in the audience, there was a QA with the audience, and someone asked him, "What do you think about Emerson, Lake and Palmer's version of Hoedown?" And he hesitated for a minute, and he said, "Well, it's really a terrible thing to hear your music ruined." Just like that. And yet Alberto Ginastera loved what they did with Toccata.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
everyone has a different way of looking at what's done with their music.
I think the latter was a bit more open to interpretation than Copeland was.
Possibly, yeah.
So eventually you also did a fantastic book on the Beatles as well in 1994, was that, or 92? I'm trying to remember now.
I think it came out in 95. I probably wrote it in 94. Because I remember it coming out around the same time as the anthology, which, on one hand was kind of handy because Beatles were in the news. And on the other hand was not handy because the Beatles were telling their own story. So who needs mine necessarily? But I enjoyed writing that book. I wrote that book in like 19 days.
Wow.
And half that time I was sitting there with my guitar at my desk and that book of Beatles scores done by a handful of Japanese guys who sort of wrote down, pretty exact versions, with the proper chord fingerings and all that, not just C, D, E written across the top of the page. And I'd sit there and play them, and once you have it under your hands, it's different than just listening to it, and so I would say, oh, this is great, let's see what the next one's like, and wasn't getting the writing done, but nevertheless managed to get it done in 19 days because I just knew that stuff and loved it, and the book was only like 50,000 words, so compared with the McCartney Legacy, which I think was about 350,000 words by the time we finished it. That took a lot longer to do, but yeah, the Beatles book was for a British company called Phaidon.
Yep.
And it was part of a series of composer biographies, 20th century composers. At the time I was asked to do that, all the other composers in the series were classical composers. After the Beatles one came out and did pretty well, I think they decided to do a few more pop and jazz people in the series too. But I think that book is actually still in print. They redid it a little with a new cover and slight updates. Not too much. They're just fixing some errors and things, and they gave it a new name, which was From the Cavern to the Rooftop.
Yep.
So it's still out there.
Well, nobody can see because this won't go out as a video, but both of us are sat in front of our own instruments. I've got a few of mine at the back of me, the Fenders are at the back of me. So we are all we're both musicians here, and we both love to play Beatles songs. Self-promotion here, I do the music for the toppermost of the poppermost. So or my versions of Beatles songs anyway. So on to this fabulous book, the McCartney Legacy. Now, I said to you before in chat, before we started recording a day or so ago, the introduction to it really jumped out at me, where you wrote that introduction about the fact that McCartney describes, is much like all of us really. There's how we project ourselves to others outside of, or to the mass public outside, and how we are in in ourselves behind closed doors, shall we say. And McCartney said a few times that when he's in a situation with the media, most of the time, there are times when he's been caught out, Life magazine, for instance, but a lot of the time he will be this other person essentially, and not the private Paul McCartney. So that I found interesting, because you were explaining about the certain stories and anecdotes that he will tell throughout the years, and a lot of people pick up on them, and they'll accuse him of, dare we say, lying, where you were saying, in a sense, he's not lying per se. It's actually a performance. And I was saying to you, much like I see a performance over the years of Dylan, where Bob Dylan does exactly the same thing, and he has done for many years, where he will come up with a version of the truth, which isn't necessarily the truth, but it creates like almost a mysticism, or a very different, it creates its own performance essentially.
Yeah, Dylan was a lot more extreme
Yeah.
than Paul. In the beginning of his career, he used to go on the radio in New York, and I've got a lot of these interviews in my collection, and he would talk about how, when he was 13, he ran away to the circus and went out to Oklahoma, and he didn't do any of that. It was absolutely fictional. In his case, who knows why he was doing it? I'm not sure. Unlike Paul, with Paul, sometimes he just tells an idealized version of the details, or in some cases, one, for instance, is that story about Live and Let Die. And it's actually George Martin's story that Paul has adopted, even though Paul knows it's not true.
Yeah.
Which is that when the record was finished, George Martin's story is he took it to Jamaica and he played it for the producers, and they said to him, well, okay, this is a great demo, Paul. George, who are we going to get to do it? And George Martin is saying, well, but this is Paul McCartney. If you don't use this recording, I'm not sure you're going to get the song, and from his point of view, he saved the day, and the Paul McCartney recording was used in Live and Let Die. What we found in a university in Wisconsin has a collection of materials relating to Bond films, and we found the memo of agreement between Eon Productions, which did the Bond films, and MPL, which is Paul's company. And according to that agreement, he was hired specifically to write the song, and his recording with Wings would be used as the title music specifically. But there was also going to be a second scene in the movie where the song was performed in a disco, and they wanted it to be by a soul singer or a female singer. According to this memo of agreement, it was supposed to originally be The Fifth Dimension, and Paul had agreed to produce The Fifth Dimension's recording. So wow. Paul's totally up on this, and eventually the Fifth Dimension had to drop out. They ended up getting a singer named Brenda Arno, who Paul didn't produce, but George Martin did. And anyway, there was never any danger that Paul's song was not going to be used in the title credits. And George Martin may not have known that because he wasn't necessarily privy to the contracts. No. But Paul was privy to the contracts and he signed them, so he knew, but he adopted George Martin's story because it really is a great story, you got to admit. And there's no reason Paul would have assumed that anybody would ever read the contracts. Why would anybody? So nobody would challenge this. And now, we've come along and found that it's a story like a number of stories that he tells. He told it most recently in his lyrics book, just like that, great demo, who are you going to get, and so, when I talk about a performance, I'm thinking of, for a public person like Paul, and particularly a public musician like Paul, his performances are what he does on albums and what he does on stage, but there is a degree to which his public life is a performance too.
Yeah.
And so if he wants to tell a story a certain way, um, it's, you could say he's lying, but you could also say, no, this is part of the performance that Paul McCartney is creating, which is called Paul McCartney, the public person, you know. Now he also would make a distinction between, just looking at himself, there were two of me here. There's me, who's me, the person born Paul McCartney, grew up, had a family, have friends, people who know me, they know me, Paul McCartney.
Yeah.
Now you who are out there coming to my concerts and buying my records, you know him, that version of Paul McCartney, the him version of Paul McCartney, which Paul doesn't necessarily totally see as himself. He knows it's himself, but it's also a projection that he is, willfully projecting. He's not going as far as Dylan saying he ran off and joined the circus, but he has his story that he wants to tell. And in his case as well, some of it is just also the fact that he's 80 years old, and that is an awful lot of stuff to remember. So when Paul says, when Bloody Sunday happened in Ireland, which caused him to write Give Ireland Back to the Irish, I was in New York. But we know from Denny Sywell's diaries, which he let us have and helped us establish an airtight timeline for this book, we know that he was in London. He was in London listening to the BBC coverage, really upset about it, sat down to write that song very quickly. And Denny came to visit him that day. And that night, they went out to the Rainbow to see Mountain at the top of the bill, and the second bill was the Jimmy McCulloch Band. And of course, Jimmy McCulloch turns up in volume 2 as Wing's second lead guitarist. So
Spoiler.
Yeah. So, I don't, is Paul lying when he says he was in New York? No, in that case, I think he just doesn't remember. He has some visceral memory probably of being in New York, but he may be conflating it with some other time he was in New York, and something happened. But so there's a lot of stuff like that. But I do think that, the him and me thing is something that he's mentioned periodically. It comes up a few times in this book. In one case, when he is with Francie Schwartz before Linda came over, and their romance started, and they went up to Liverpool and he got drunk, and he just sort of harangue is too strong a word, but was saying to her, well, you look at me and you see him, but I'm not him, I'm me, and she has that in her book. And I thought, that's actually kind of interesting, seeing as he, on a couple of other occasions, has brought up this him and me thing too. And he's also talked about being a Gemini, which is, the dual kind of astrology sign of the Gemini twins. And another British journalist had brought that up to him. And after it was mentioned to him, he began adopting it almost jokingly, well, I have these two sides, but of course I'm a Gemini, So he's a complicated man, a fascinating, complicated man.
He is, but you take him on a tangent here with what you've just said that I've always thought, which is that another really good thing about Paul that I've thought over the years is he's almost like a creative sponge as well at the same time. So it's a lot like, so when he worked with John, they were both learning off each other when he worked with John. But then I see the same again, it's almost like history's been a bit poor to Denny Lane in a way, as being Paul, you know, working with Paul for all those years in a sense. And I actually think that Paul learned a lot from Denny as well, and vice versa. So when they were working on songs over that time, I can see where Denny's way with his writing would touch on Paul's, because there's a lot of what Denny, the way that Denny writes, that wasn't so obvious pre-Wings, that became a huge part of Paul's oeuvre from then onwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll have to look more closely for that as we go along, because in the first book, the only thing of Denny's that Wings recorded was No Words, and that was a collaboration between Paul and Denny. Denny had a couple of his earlier songs in Wings' tour set in 1973, maybe a little in 72 as well. But you know, I haven't really noted that much of an influence of Denny on Paul, but now that you mention it, I'll have to look. I know that, for instance, on this will be at the very end of Volume 2, Back to the Egg, when we get there, you know, Denny's song Again and Again and Again, you know, is very McCartney-esque to me. And there may have been something going both ways there. It's interesting. There's also a song I just was writing about the other day, because I'm in there in Volume 2. I'm in 1974 in Nashville, and Denny did a song called Send Me the Heart, which
Lovely
they never
song.
released, but it ended up on one of his solo albums. And there the deal was Paul wrote Sally G and challenged Denny to come up with a country song too, and Send Me the Heart was the response. And it's very different from Sally G. You know, they both used very different sort of country music. I don't want to say cliches, but, you know, certain moves that you find in a lot of country songs. Paul uses certain ones, Denny uses certain ones, and they're different ones, you know. And they got in pedal steel players and country people from Nashville to play it, and they all sound very comfortable with it. So you know, Paul did try to encourage Denny to contribute a lot more than he did, and it's kind of interesting, because, you know, when Denny came to Paul, he had an album which became Allan started, but not close to finished. And he just sort of set that aside and went and joined Wings. And it was a couple of years later he finally finished it. And in the he finished it in 73 and put it out, did interviews about it, all that kind of stuff. And just before his album came out, they did this British tour in 73. And Paul says in several interviews, you know, I really want to get Denny to write more stuff, you know, because Paul wanted it to be a band. You know, he didn't want it to be just backing people. And he thought that Denny, you know, Denny could write, maybe he can have some input here. And he began encouraging him in interviews and saying, you know, I don't want to force him, but, you know, it would be great if he wrote some songs too. And Denny is, you know, Denny is sometimes an unfathomable character, because here he is, they're about to go record Band on the Run. He has one song that's going to be on that. He has just put out an album of material that he had not previously released. And while he's doing interviews for that album, journalists are saying, so are you going to do, you going to write some things for Wings? And he said, well, you know, I don't really have any material. Now, it's really hard to understand how you could say that while you're sitting there promoting an album that you just finished and just put out. You know, you obviously have material. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, Denny's a bit of a mystery.
But also a really good writer. When I listen to Mull of Kintyre, for instance, and I look at the lyrics to that, I look at it almost in a way where, because there's in some of Denny's writing, they're very, very wordy and very poetic in some places.
Mhm.
And it's almost like Paul brought Denny in on a song that Paul had brought. This is my assumption. And then Denny sort of like helped him to clean up a few bits where Paul hadn't quite got what was needed, or he'd got bits that were missing. And
Mm.
essentially Denny was sort of an editor. And that's how I sort of see that as an outsider. I'm not sure whether that's how it was or not.
Yeah, I mean, he did that with, I think he might have done a little bit of that on I Lie Around. And but on No Words, actually, it had started as Denny's song, and Denny hadn't finished it, and Paul finished it off for him, or with him. Or Paul had, this is one of Paul's big moves, is going to a completely other song and pirating it in. So
Yeah.
he had something that he hadn't finished that he thought would fit with Denny's song, and they melded that together. I mean, it's basically, you might call it the A Day in the Life move.
Yes. Yeah.
you know and Paul does that an awful lot in this first book, and subsequently too. You see lots of things where he will sort of graft an unfinished older song onto a new idea and finish it off that way. Another Day was like that.
Yeah.
um, Little Lamb Dragonfly was really two songs, one about a lamb, one about a dragonfly, and they happened to fit together nicely, so they did.
The pound
Uh,
is sinking.
yeah. And also a lot of he occasionally will put out a medley kind of thing, like at the end of Red Rose Speedway, Power Cut and all those. These are songs that are, it's a different move, where instead of taking a piece of an unfinished song and finishing another unfinished song, what he's doing here is just taking a bunch of unfinished songs and making them into a medley, like on side 2 of Abbey Road. I say side 2 because I'm old enough to remember LPs, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
um, but with the medley on Red Rose Speedway, it's kind of interesting because he doesn't just leave it as, okay, I'm sticking a bunch of unfinished songs together, which, by the way, is pretty much the way he described it. But if you listen to the song, or to the medley, you hear that at the end he begins bringing back themes from the earlier songs in the medley at the very end. And that's something a classical composer would do. It's a very compositional move, and it makes it into more than just a bunch of bits stuck together. It makes it into some sort of an overall composition, even though the individual sections are fundamentally unrelated.
Yep, it's got it's very close to almost like what progressive rock artists do when they get bits and pieces and sort of like meld them together. Like Yes will do it, and King Crimson would do it, and they would have little bits where they would stick them together, but they would keep coming back to an overall theme, or eventually they would come back to, they'd have these little themes that appear here and there and everywhere, which is, like I said, very much a classical thing. And so what else was there about it? We were saying before we started recording, one of my favorite bits about the book is the fact that I've said before that I have a problem with a lot of books about the solo Beatles, where you'll buy a book about one of the solo Beatles, and the first half to 3/4 of the book, I might be exaggerating here, but the majority of it would be about the Beatles, that 10-12 year period, well, from mid to late 50s until 1970 there. And then this little bit there will be all about the following so many years of solo career, which like I said, was almost like bullet point working. Whereas your book, it's not looking at the Beatles, it's looking at them as a solo artist and zoning in on that, which I think is really important, because this guy has been solo for over 50 years, essentially been away from the Beatles for over 50 years. So it's actually given a lot more respect to that 50 years, so that people can look there and go, well, actually, he has done this, this, and this. And when you look in this first book, my God, this guy is so busy doing so many things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's why we did it that way. And I don't know if we mentioned my co-author, Adrian Sinclair.
Yeah.
I don't you might
I
have
mentioned it in the opening that you
yeah.
co-wrote it with Adrian. Yes.
Yeah, Adrian, this was Adrian's idea originally, this book. And what he wanted to do at the start was something similar to Mark Lewison's Beatles recording sessions, but with Paul stuff. And he asked me, would if I do the studio stuff, would you be interested in just doing the some sort of a wraparound chapter for each album of what was going on in Paul's life at the time, and but we both, he was doing an awful lot of research into the songs and into what Paul was doing, and I was doing some of that too. We were both doing interviews, and a number of things happened. One of them was the turning point for Adrian is we were interviewing Denny Sywell, Paul's the drummer in Wings,
Yeah.
and also studio drummer on Ram.
Nice guy.
Yeah, he's a great guy. And I interviewed him first, and then Adrian interviewed him the second of the 4 or 5 times that we interviewed him, and he did all the rest of the interviews, because during that talk, Denny said, by the way, I used to keep a log of my sessions, and my wife used to keep a diary. Would you be interested in that? Like we might say no, and that was absolutely invaluable. I mean, I mentioned before with Sunday, Bloody Sunday, that it was his diary that established, for us where Paul was, and that went all the way through, because we knew pretty much everything he and Wings were doing every day of that period, what they recorded in the studio, how it went, stuff like that. Because I mean, not a lot of detail about how it went in the diary, but talking to Denny, that was helpful. We talked to engineers, anyone we could find who was around. But we really felt, as you say, that, so many biographies of Paul McCartney are, 70% his life through the Beatles. And then the last 30% is just a little synopsis of that 50-year plus solo career. And we felt that, this isn't doing the solo career justice. And the Beatles story at this point has been told, quite a lot, and we're still waiting for the next 2 volumes of Mark Lewison's book. And Mark, I should say, we're both good friends of his, and he at one point was visiting and basically sat me down and said, look, I know you want to do a sessionography kind of thing, but what's really needed is a biography, a full detailed biography.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you're probably right. I know you're right. And Adrian and I began talking about it, and I'm not sure if this was before or after the Denny offer of the diaries, but somehow it all kind of came together. So we did an outline, met with an agent, and the rest is history, as it were. But Mark encouraged us in that, and it's kind of amusing now that in a way, it's impossible to be a Beatles writer now and not be influenced by the work that Mark has done, and so it's been kind of amusing to us that one of the reviews of the book begins, this book is entirely Mark Lewison's fault, and and the guy who wrote it didn't know half of it,
No.
but what he meant was, because Mark has been detailing the Beatles in that kind of granular, detail, that this is what we're doing with McCartney, and you can blame Mark for that. The New York Times, when they reviewed it, wrote that we out Lewison. So it's been kind of amusing. I mean, but to me, this is how a book should be, and it's how I would do it if it was about a classical composer. But Paul is a rock composer, and I'm not sure I make the distinction that perhaps a lot of people in the classical music world would want me to make. Paul didn't learn how to read and write notes, but he is an incredibly musical person, and intuitively he just knows how to, first of all, as a melodist,
Yeah.
you just don't run into that many people with that gift that he has. But also structurally, I mean, I was writing today about Junior's Farm. Junior's Farm is, it's not the most amazing song that Paul ever did, but just looking at the way he structured it, and that's one thing that I've got from doing this book, is looking closely at a lot of the songs that I just sort of knew as songs. I didn't really focus on that closely, but looking at them and looking at how they came together, through the studio documentation and, who overdubbed what. It's fascinating. It's really just incredible. It's like looking over a classical composer's shoulder as he decides to, write this section this way and that section that way and put them together. So I'm learning a ton from this experience.
Which one was it where you were saying in the book? Was it? No, it wasn't Junior's Farm. It was High, 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 where they were saying that there were. Didn't they end up doing like 12 guitar overdubs for it in total? And then they must have then sort of like pieced it together almost like a jigsaw, essentially, to pick what was which guitar was right for which section.
Yeah. Well, High, High, High was like a real problem for them because they did hundreds of takes.
Yeah.
It started out as, they had a live recording from the 1972 European tour, and they really wanted to put that out. They had like 5 live recordings of it, and they chose one and said, yeah, this is the one. We'll put this out. And then Paul listened to it and said, no, we can do it a bit better. So they started off overdubbing onto the live recording to try to just fix little things that Paul thought could be better or whatever. And they did that for, a couple of sessions. And then he said, well, let's just start it all new, in the studio. And they changed it from the live version as a shuffle beat. And the studio version, he decided, okay, the shuffle beat isn't going to work for us in here for some reason. Let's just make it a more straightforward beat. So now you have basically 2 versions of High, 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 especially now that the live Wings Live in Europe has come out. Now that is officially a released track. So you have 2 very different ways of playing High, 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 both available publicly. But they just kept, adding and overdubbing and starting afresh and overdubbing again. And the band and the engineers were sort of driven crazy by it. But this is the other thing about Paul. He's a perfectionist.
Yeah.
And he wants it the way he wants it. And he has a vision in his head, and he'll just keep going until he gets there, It's one of the things interesting that Ringo said in the, in the lawsuit of, when Paul had to sue the others to get out of Apple and, out of the business partnership. Ringo said something like, with one thing about Paul is he'll go on and on until he gets his own way. But is that way with his own music? It's just a personality trait. He's focused, let's say.
But he would do the same thing again eventually. He would do it over and over again throughout his career. He would start a song in a certain way, and only when he felt that the song was exactly right would he stop. And another case in point, which you'll get to eventually, will be with a song like Take It Away, which started initially as almost like a reggae-styled song, and it changed so much arrangement-wise over the time that it was perfect when it came out. He got it to that stage where it was like, it's almost like there's a thing in his head where it tells him where it's absolutely what he wants it to be. Mm-hmm. And the change in that song, and he's always done that throughout his career. He's always kept at it with different versions. I mean, that's why there are so many different versions of Beatles songs and alternative takes, is because they're trying to get that one take that's absolutely right to their ears. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very focused in that way, and yet contrasting that, he has an insecure side. Again, this is the him and me. In a way, the him is the guy who's put out these records, and I stand behind these records. These records are great, blah blah blah. Yet at one point, he was having a really sort of down day. And it happened to be a day when he was going to be playing on Top of the Pops. They were going to do My Love, and the rest of the band was late, and he was getting depressed. And there were two journalists there uh, interviewing him. And he's saying this, really kind of down on himself stuff. Like, I mean, here he's at this point recorded through Red Rose Speedway, and and My Love, it was their current single. So, and he's saying, I don't think I've yet done the album that I can do. In fact, I don't really like anything that I've done, and I know that I can do a really great album, and I haven't done it yet. So there's that side of him too. That's like the ultra self-critical side that in a way drives something like the high, 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 to keep going until he's got what he has in mind. But there's also this thing inside him that, wants to do something better than he's done. He may be happy with it once he's done it, but then when he steps back, he'll say, well, it's okay, but I can do more. I can do better, He said that he felt that way about Revolver too. He felt that Revolver was entirely out of tune, which we've all heard Revolver. It's not out of tune.
No. No.
But he just has these moments of self-criticism or self-doubt. And that in a way too is, what drives him to be the perfectionist that he is.
But it also explains moments like when they did the reissue of Red Rose Speedway, he was surprised in a way about how it was received, because originally he perceived Red Rose Speedway, I think because people had basically said this to him or around him, they'd seen Red Rose Speedway this way, and it's almost like his opinion of that album and those sessions was shaped by what people who criticized actually said about it at the time. And then when it came out as the deluxe edition, there was this big, like, it's amazing the amount of people that suddenly realized, as I'd always thought, that it was a really good album, because I've always liked that album.
Yeah. I think it would have been a totally different story if they had released the double album that he meant it to be.
Yeah.
The double album was vastly different, not just that there was twice as much of it, but the fact that, Denny had a couple of songs on it and a couple of vocals. Linda had Seaside Woman on it originally. Yeah. It was meant to show Wings as a band, and EMI said, yeah, that's great, but we want to sell a Paul McCartney album. We don't really care about, the band. So it got sort of cut back to, Denny's songs were gone, Seaside Woman was gone. It became really a Paul McCartney focused album. And the rest of Wings was a little depressed about that too, because, this was part of the effort to show that Wings really was a band, not just backing guys, which in a way they also were. It's a very difficult position. You could be a great drummer like Denny Sywell and a very, experienced player like Denny or, Hugh. But if you're in a band with Paul McCartney, that sort of changes the geography a bit in terms of how critics will perceive it, how the record company will perceive it. And Paul, with the other players, really did try to fight against that to a big degree. Eventually he just sort of gave up on that and realized that Wings was the backing group. And this is another thing that Denny was kind of weird about. When they came back from doing Band on the Run, he gave interviews where he said, here at this point, Wings is just Paul, Linda, and Denny. And Wings says, and Denny says, well, this is really Paul and Linda's album. I'm just there as a utility guy. It's kind of, I don't understand the way he thinks of himself a lot of the time. He had a song on that album that he sang. Yeah. Anyway, they're all complicated. It's a great bunch to write a book about, gotta say.
It is, but at the same time as well, you've got that going throughout the narrative and the descriptions of what's being recorded and the sessions, but you've also got these. I like it where you've got these little bits of descriptions of things like where you have songs that are known under a certain title, and then you will explain that that will eventually be changed and that will become this song,
Right.
and you've got all these little you've got these footnotes all over the place that give more detail here and there,
Yeah.
almost like a prophecy of this is what it is now, but it's going to be this eventually.
Well, that was because we decided that we wanted to write the book in sort of in the same way as Mark Lewison wrote Tune In, and Chip Mattinger wrote Lennonology, which is lack of foreknowledge is the way, they put it, which is that we're writing this book as if we don't know what is going to happen. We're writing it in the moment. We're following the events as they are. Now, with the Beatles and with John Lennon, that's comparatively easy to do because the Beatles did not leave tons of leftovers in the can in the studio, and neither did John, but Paul did.
Yeah.
Paul recorded a ton of stuff for Ram, some of which ended up on Red Rose Speedway, some of which came out, was as late as the 2000s. So with him, it's very difficult to not be able to look ahead and say this is what became of this track that he recorded. But having agreed to do it this way, we felt bound by that. But so I proposed using the footnotes as a way of getting into a different timeline. The footnotes are the reality as we know it now. So I was able to say in the footnotes sometimes what would eventually become of something, but in the text itself, you're reading it as it's happening and you don't necessarily know. So if something is called mood music, we're going to call it mood music, even though really everybody knows it as Bridge on the River Suite.
Yeah.
So what we did in the studio entries is we would put, original title of Bridge over the River Suite or something like that. And sometimes in the footnotes, I might say what eventually happened to it. But even there, we try not to do too much of this, what eventually happened to it, because then you're really not doing the lack of foreknowledge, So I use that in the footnotes a lot of the time to talk about other things, like, for instance, when Hugh McCracken is called originally to record on Ram and isn't available because he's in Florida recording with Aretha Franklin. I was able to use the footnote to say, what he was recording, what the name of the album eventually was, and when it was released. So you get the story filled out in the footnote, but in the text, you're sort of doing it without the foreknowledge. You can have it either way. A lot of people don't read footnotes. I can't think why, but there it is.
Were you able to get hold of Hughes, any of Hughes' documentation as well? Because I would have thought that him being a session player as well, he would have had a lot of diary or records of what he was up to as well.
Yeah, but since he's no longer with us, we weren't able really to get in contact with anyone who might have those things, and so in his case, we had to rely on published interviews and things like that. And he was, Hugh was very plain spoken. When he was disappointed with something, he said so, and when he was happy with something, he said so. And he has an interesting role in this book. His solo on My Love is it's one of the great solos in McCartney singles, and it almost didn't happen because Paul likes people to play what he wants them to play. He wants to think of the solo and have the person in the band execute it, which goes against that idea of we're really a band, because if we're really a band, then everybody in the band has musical input. And with My Love, I think they had already done 13 takes, and Hugh wasn't happy with the solo he was asked to play, and said to
Henry.
Paul, yeah, Henry.
Yep.
Uh,
Sorry.
Guitar players.
I know.
And he went to Paul and said, let me give it a try. And we have interviews from the time where Paul is saying, I'm thinking, oh no, I want it this way. Okay, I'll let him do it. And he lets him do it just for one take, and they're playing it live with orchestra. So it was just sort of magic that it came out as well as it did, and Paul loved it. And Henry was thrilled that he got one of his ideas on the disc, and the record came out and the critics loved it. So, but then it happened again with No Words, Denny's song on Band on the Run. And Henry wanted to play a solo he had in mind, and Paul just wasn't having it. And that's when Henry quit. So yeah, band dynamics. It's another thing that, we get into a lot in the book, not overtly saying, here are some aspects of band dynamics, but just looking at the relationships and who says what to who in the studio and who does what and what the response is. It's just sort of a fascinating dynamic, just psychologically.
Yeah, I mean, you've even got documentation of Henry being paid as well, on one of them in there as well, which I almost did a double take when I saw it. And I thought, how did you get hold of that? All this documentation you've got hold of is incredible.
Yeah, well, it's out there if you know where to find it, and I'm sure there's tons of stuff we never did find. So we're still looking for things for volume 2 and forward. And I'm hoping we'll be as lucky as we were with volume 1, because we did find an awful lot of really interesting stuff, and it helped us tell a story that was, everyone knows the outlines of Paul's career, but a lot of the details have never really been gone into, and we were able to do that, and that's what we aimed to do. So yeah, worked out.
Well, I'm guessing that volume 1 was helped a lot by, we've already mentioned, by Denny Sywell, because he was, many people might not know, but he was really helpful when Paul was putting together the Wingspan set, or what happened then as well, because if you look, a lot of the time you'll see in the book, there's a lot of the Wingspan book when it came out. I mean, it's a flawed project, Wingspan, in some ways, but where it works, there's little bits where there's pictures that they've got hold of and details that they've got hold of through, like you said, all this incredible wealth of information that Denny and his wife Micheline have been able to keep hold of for all these years and have still got.
Yeah, I don't really know what he contributed to Wingspan. Are there things credited to him in there? I don't remember, because talking to him, he kind of indicated that he didn't really do very much on that. In a way, Wingspan was kind of a make good project for Paul. Denny and Jeff Britton and other people were paid big consulting fees, partly as a way of making up for what Paul recognized was kind of an inequitable way of, well, during their time with Wings, for instance, Denny felt that they weren't as well paid as they should have, because when he joined, the deal was, you're all going to be co-owners of this band. We're all going to profit from the recordings. We're all going to get money from the tours. But Paul's money was also tied up in Apple at the time. Yeah. And there was only a certain amount that he was going to pay out of his own pocket. And he was paying for, the tour buses and touring equipment and everything else that was going on. That was coming right out of Paul's own cash. Everything was going into Apple. The record royalties were going into Apple. So all of those promises that he had made when he formed Wings, he was actually unable to keep, and he had put them on a 70-pound a week retainer. And Denny Sywell in particular, but Henry too, also, they felt that, we're not actually co-owners of this band. And in fact, we're struggling to make ends meet. Denny would keep flying back to the States anytime Paul gave them a week off. He would fly back to New York to do some session work because he was a top flight session guy. He was paid triple rate. And, so he would come back here to make some money to pay off his Amex bill, is the way he put it. And then go back to England. So the Wingspan fees were sort of Paul's recognition that, they felt hard done by, and I don't disagree with them totally. So I'm going to hire them as consultants for Wingspan, but I don't think he really asked them to do that much consulting. It was just kind of a way of making that better. Paul gets criticized a lot for being, cheap or whatever, but, sometimes there are things like this that are not widely known. He'll try to make things good when he can, not all the time. I mean, there are various people with all kinds of, stories and grudges about this and that. But in these cases, in the case of Denny and Jeff Britton and other Wings players, he did make an effort to contact them and, pay them a very substantial fee that would make up for whatever they felt was unjust about their time in Wings financially.
Yep. And also, just in passing, you have experience as well of actually speaking with Paul, as in interviewing him as well, for newspapers and magazines. I would have thought that, I mean, I just do this as a bit, but as podcast. But I would have thought that when you're interviewing Paul, are you looking at areas specifically to try and get almost like new little tidbits of information, essentially? Because I think a lot of the time when people interview Paul, it's almost like the same old questions, which is why you get the same anecdotes. Right. So when you're doing it, are you trying to get new information each time?
Well, yeah. Generally speaking, that's a good way to put it, because when I've interviewed him, first of all, it's usually been about a particular project. So for instance, Memory Almost Full, we're obviously going to be talking mostly about Memory Almost Full, but, I'll usually try and ask some other historical questions. And, basically, even before getting involved with this book, I had read hundreds and hundreds of McCartney interviews and had them in my collection. And, so I was determined, for instance, not to give him any opportunity to tell me that he dreamed yesterday, or that he went vegetarian because of the Gambling Lambs, or, I mean, there's most people who are really into McCartney have sort of lists of his set piece stories. And as an interviewer, I wanted to avoid them. And in fact, once when I was still at the Times, I got a call from someone at one of the television stations here who was going to be traveling down to, I guess, Charlotte to interview Paul. So this would have been 93. And she said, can you give me any pointers? And I said, well, here's the thing, just get your hands on as many of his interviews as you can, and try not to ask him anything that will have him tell you the same things. I mean, this is, you would think, is sort of basic journalism, and I said to her, we all have his stories, like, numbered, like number 623, I dreamed yesterday, getting better all the time. And John said, it can't get much worse. All the stories, so what she did is she went to him and said, so I called Allan Kozinn at the Times, And I said, I asked him for some tips, and he said that you have all these set pieces and that all of your fans have them all numbered. So you have to not tell me those ones that they have numbered. And I said, well, wait a minute. Did you told them that, like, that I said that like by name? You said me? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, I really think the least you can do is give me all the outtakes from your interview footage. And she wouldn't do it. But, this is how we get this stuff, you see.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well,
On the other hand, when I was at the Times as well, towards the end of my time there, other people were interviewing him as well. And we had a music reporter named Dan Waken who interviewed him about his ballet that he was doing at the New York City Ballet. And he asked something about, do you have any idea of, what the plot is for this, for the music you've written? And Dan said to me, he said a very peculiar thing. He said, I haven't come up with a story for that answer yet. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because, when I interviewed him, I would ask questions, and, he answered them, and they were not the set piece answers. And they were very fresh, and I thought they were actually very frank. I asked him, for instance, about the fact that, when they were in the Beatles, they had this policy about not putting the singles on the albums. And yet, as a solo artist, he was putting out, CD singles in 5 different versions available only in Japan, each version having 3 B-sides that were otherwise unavailable, so that if you were an American collector, you had to go get all these Japanese singles to get all of his stuff. And he said, well, you have to understand that when we were in the Beatles, there were 4 of us. And if we didn't like an idea, we could just say, and he used an epithet ending in "you" to the record company guy. And he said, but, I'm not the Beatles. I have to think very carefully. If an A&R guy or a promotion guy comes to me and says, we think this would be a really good idea, I have to think very carefully before I say no. And I have to consider what they want to do. So it's different from when I was in the Beatles. Now, that kind of answer is I was absolutely not expecting from him,
yeah.
because it doesn't fit into the constructed him persona of, Paul McCartney superstar. It was, I thought, unusually frank. And I was kind of surprised, but the interviews were really that way. And I really enjoyed doing them. But he's just a trip to interview, because you walk in the room and he makes you feel as if you're old pals. You go way back. You may never have met him before, but he makes you feel like you go way back, and you feel you've met him before in a way, because you know so much about him, and or the him
Yeah.
the me him necessarily.
Yeah.
But he completely makes you comfortable, unless there's something about you he doesn't like. I mean, I've seen some combative interviews with him too. But we've always had a pretty friendly time. And I'm sorry that he didn't want to talk for the book, but with Paul, he doesn't mind talking to journalists, and talking to journalists really is also helping him promote whatever he's got on at the moment. But talking to a biographer is a completely different thing. And he just didn't want to participate in that. But he also didn't stop anyone from talking to us. And a lot of people went to him, since we're interviewing people in his orbit, people he works with or worked with. People went to him and said, do you mind if I talk to these guys? And he said no every time. So, people came and felt free to talk to us. So that was, we're glad that he didn't do anything to obstruct us. We're hoping that he reads the book and says, yeah, these guys take me seriously and treat my work with respect, and I should talk to them for volume 2. We'll see if that happens.
he actually contacted you once, didn't he? I think when you didn't you do a review of one of his classical pieces? Was it
Right, the
which one?
Liverpool Oratorio.
Liverpool Oratorio, and he actually contacted you personally and talked to you about it and how happy he was with the and gave you some responses to what you'd actually said in the review.
Well, I was, it was at a press conference
Yep.
in New York, and he saw me in the audience. And, he obviously, we had only had one interview before, and I was once before that was at a small round table with maybe half a dozen journalists. So he'd only ever seen me twice. And he spotted me in the audience. I'm not sure I'd recognize him, obviously, but I'm not sure I'd recognize someone I had just seen twice when I'm interviewed by hundreds of people a year. But he did his press conference, and he went off stage, and he told, it was at Carnegie Hall's small hall, Wild Recital Hall, and he told one of Carnegie's publicists, "I saw Allan Kozinn out there. I'd like to have a chat with him." And they came up to me and said, Paul wants to see you. So they brought me around, and he just said, you gave that piece a chance, and I wanted to thank you for that, because most of my classical colleagues did not give it a chance. It was very negatively reviewed. And you know what? I've listened to the piece recently, and I still like it, because let's face it, the Liverpool Oratorio is fundamentally expanded song forms. And if there's one thing Paul McCartney can do, it's a song form, right?
Yeah.
Plus he had, this long violin solo that I commented in the review. He might want to try a concerto as well, because that was actually pretty good. And it turned out, when I interviewed him in 2007 about Memory Almost Full, he said, "Well, I've got to go because I'm writing a guitar concerto, and I'm meeting with the guitarist, who was Carlos Bonell, British guitarist, and who I knew. And, so we're just going over some stuff, and that concerto's never come out. I'd love to hear it. If he hasn't finished it, I wish he would."
Well, I'm just going to say that there is a famous quote from Bob Dylan, who says that he actually thinks that McCartney is one of the greatest melodists that he's ever known. So I mean, that's high praise indeed, really, from Bob.
Yeah. Well, and he is one of the greatest melodists, of our time, certainly, maybe of all time. Listen to something like "Backseat of My Car." It's listen to almost anything of his. He knows how to sort of pluck a tune from out of the air and make it sound like the most natural thing there is, even though it's completely fresh and, undeniably his. It's got his thumbprint on it. So, yeah.
But also at the same time, I was listening to an interview with completely different. I was listening to an interview the other day that the guys from Soda Jerker did with Michael Penn. And Michael Penn was saying that something that he does himself, and McCartney does this a lot, where he won't go for what sounds like the natural note, essentially, that you'd pick out of there. And Michael Penn was saying that sometimes you'll play it on an instrument and you'll hear an harmonic or something on the instrument that's not natural, but they'll pick up on that. And I think Paul does that a lot, where he'll be playing and he'll pluck out a note that isn't natural from that chord, but it works perfectly in that sequence and in that melody.
Yeah, he does that a lot. He'll throw in a chord that you don't expect, or he'll modulate, into a different key. Or the fact that he never learned music theory and never learned to read and write music is so inconsequential compared with what he's achieved. I mean, in fact, it's so inconsequential compared with what he's achieved that there are times when I think, I wonder if he's faking that whole thing about not being able to read and write music, because, but I don't think he is. I mean, he says things sometimes that kind of bring home the fact that that's true. Like when he says that he doesn't want to learn to read and write music because he's afraid that he'll subconsciously plagiarize something. And the example he gives is somewhere from Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story.
Yep.
And he'll say, I found out that, that melody is actually from Beethoven's Second Piano Concerto. And I don't want to be in a position where I'm, accidentally doing that. But the thing is, Bernstein did it. It wasn't accidental. It was, he knew totally what he was doing. And it was exactly the same as when Paul sat down to write I'm Down. I'm Down. Basically, you could say he's subconsciously plagiarizing Little Richard. He's not really plagiarizing Little Richard, but he's writing a song that had all the Little Richard moves. And what was it written for? It was written to become the Beatles' set closer instead of Long Tall Sally. So, I think if he were to think of it that way, instead of, I might accidentally quote another composer's work, I think he might feel more comfortable. Although, at this point at 80, is he going to start learning all that stuff? Probably not. But, he does know a lot of classical music. When he's in New York, which is, quite a lot, he pops into Carnegie Hall all the time. And I used to know an usher there, and he would tell me what Paul came for. He came for the Britain War Requiem. He came for, he comes for some pretty sophisticated stuff, and he knows it. So I think he doesn't like to admit that he knows it because it makes him feel like maybe people will think I'm not really a rock and roller if I admit to knowing all this classical stuff. But whatever it takes, it doesn't matter. I feel comfortable with the fact that he knows what he's doing when he's writing something, whether it's a classical piece or a pop piece. And with classical pieces, he also has technical help from composers, Carl Davis in the case of the oratorio, a few other people in the case of other pieces. I like the fact that he's taken the classical stuff seriously, and I wish he would continue doing it. Some pieces I've liked more than others, but you just have to keep doing it. And he has a nice little body of classical stuff that could use some expansion, because it would also make volume 4 probably, much more varied if we have that to throw in along with the rock stuff. And by then we'll also be dealing with his paintings and his kids' books and God knows what, because we want to cover his entire creative life. That's really the point.
Well, you're just making me think now of the work that he does that's not so well known, and I'm looking forward to. I mean, this is far into the future, but when you go into the work that he's done with youth, for the firemen, etc., that will be really fascinating to listen to.
Yeah.
Anyway, wow, we've spoken a lot longer about the book than was originally intended, but it was so much fun speaking to you about it. In fact, I'll steal a question from Ed Chen that he's going to ask you, which is how you came about the structure for the book and how it was worked out and who and sort of was it a two-person thing all the way through, or did one of you did you sort of like structure it, or did you work out how you were going to do it? How did that work out?
Well, the structure is really very easy. It's just completely chronological. It doesn't get easier than that. The only place where there was any difficulty structurally is figuring out how to deal with the stuff before November 1969 or October 69, when the book opens and the Beatles have broken up and Paul is up in Scotland. We have to explain what brought us to this pass, and that means getting into the whole Alan Klein thing, and then the attempt to buy NEMS and Northern Songs and everything that was going on with the Beatles in 1969. So that meant backtracking after establishing October 69 in the first chapter. But that was the only time that any kind of decision about where to put things was made. You know, we just sort of continue along chronologically. When he walks into the recording studio, that becomes one of those studio entries, which has a heading of its own. And then when the session is done, we're back into sort of regular life, and it continues until the next session or tour or whatever it is. So structurally wasn't difficult. In terms of what we both did, in the crudest terms, Adrian was the principal researcher and I was the principal writer. But, you know, I have a huge library of Beatles and McCartney stuff sitting here, which we've utilized. Adrian has the British Library. We both did interviewing. Adrian did the lion's share of the interviewing. I did many fewer than he did, but you know, we both split things. And he'd find someone in the US and said, can you give this person a call? So I would do that. And then there were certain chapters that Adrian wanted to write. So he wrote those, and then we would each edit each other's chapters in a way. You know, he would add things to mine or take things out that he thought were excessive, or if I got, you know, too much into the weeds of musical analysis, that kind of thing. And then he'd write a chapter and I would sort of, you know, make it conform with basically US grammatical rules because it's an American publisher. There was one place where he felt strongly, and I had to give in, about the difference between US and UK grammar. In the US, we consider a corporate entity as a singular being. So we would say EMI is releasing an album. You guys would say EMI are releasing an album because, you know, it's just a philosophical difference. To you, a corporation is still a bunch of people, right? To us, it's a monolith. So what bothered Adrian was saying, you know, Wings is going on tour. He said, no, Wings are going on tour. So he says, you wouldn't say the Beatles is, would you? He says, well, no, but the Beatles is plural. Well, Wings is plural. You know, so I finally gave in on that. You know, we sent a note to our editor and said, okay, we're using American grammatical rules, except for this one thing. Do you mind? Will that be okay with you? Because we didn't want copy editors undoing everything we were doing once I'd given in on this. So, but basically we both read each other's chapters. We both, you know, sort of worked to make it a kind of unified style. And, you know, but so we both had our hands on all aspects of doing the book. Another area of Adrian's was photos. I didn't really get that involved in that, other than that, you know, he'd show me a bunch of photos and say, what do you think? What do you like? But, you know, he contacted the photographers and did all of that stuff and found, you know, there's a lot of rare photos in that book that haven't been seen before. Those are things he found. So that was another aspect of his, you know, and Adrian is a documentary producer and editor.
Yeah.
And so he thinks in very visual and almost cinematic terms, which sort of helped me a lot because I don't necessarily always write in a cinematic way, but with Adrian sitting, you know, theoretically at my side, although he's halfway across the world, you know, knowing he's going to be reading it, you know, it made me sort of think more carefully about trying to make it, you know, visual, you know, which is probably a good thing because you read a book, you want to be, you're not just reading a stream of text, you want to be able to see it happening before your eyes. So you know, Adrian was very important in that end of it too. So I think that pretty much describes how we divided stuff.
That's good. So anyway, so So changing it completely and going to what this show is mainly about most of the time.
Podcast.
How did you actually get into the world of podcasting with things we said today?
Right. Well, with that, when not my last book, but a couple of books ago, I did another book for the Times, which was an ebook
Yeah.
called "Got That Something: How the Beatles I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything."
Yeah.
And when I was doing the promotion for that, some of it was podcasts, and one of the podcasts was Things We Said Today, which at the time was Ken Michaels and Steve Marinucci
Yep.
just. And then shortly after that, they said, how would you feel about sort of joining the cast? And I said, well, I haven't really done this, but sure, and we began doing it. And then Al Sussman also joined. And then Steve and Al Sussman left, and we got Darren DeVivo, who's a radio guy from New York. And yeah, so that's how I got involved in it, basically by being a guest first, and then doing that. And I also have done a lot of things with Richard Buskin's various podcasts. They keep changing names. It was Buskin with the Beatles, it was the Beatles Naked, it was Swinging Through the 60s. I think I've been in all those incarnations. And that's just because, we're pals. And when he had a show where he needed a guest, I'd go on, but I was on so frequently that I was, for a while, an almost a regular cast member, if they were talking about the Beatles, or in some cases, we did one about Pet Sounds at the Beach Boys. Yeah, so, and those are two very different podcasts. Richard is a lot more irreverent
Yeah.
than Ken, for instance, although Ken's loosened up a lot. And yeah, so now we've been doing it. We just tonight, an hour before we started talking, we just finished, I think, episode 382 or 383.
Wow.
And I think I first went on there as a guest on like episode 68 or something. So I'm pretty sure that I joined well before episode 100. So I've been on it for most of them.
Do you have a specific role, or do the three of you just chat, and do you just come up with it on? I'm not going to say that. You must research what you're going to discuss, of course.
Sure, yeah. Okay, we each take turns being host.
Yep.
And we all come up with ideas, but a lot of them sort of suggest themselves. If Apple is going to put out an archive edition of Revolver, we're going to spend at least one, in this case, I think 2 shows on Revolver. Someone puts out a book. I mean, a few weeks ago, I was the guest on it because we talked about McCartney Legacy, and Adrian was on that too. But we have, plenty of other people who write books, or sometimes we've had Denny Sywell on the show. We've had Lawrence Juber. We've had Patty Harrison. That was a treat. We've, actually, before my time, they had what's that guy who was in the Beatles for about a week playing bass, and then he got drafted. He's one of those names that you sort of run into in a I forgot his name, sorry. But yeah, it'll come to me. But we try to get guests whenever we can. But we also will come up with topics like, okay, each choose 10 George Harrison tracks that you think are underrated, or one George Harrison album you think is underrated, or Paul or Ringo, or, whoever. The show we just did was we each chose between 5 and 10 songs that the Beatles, either in the group days or in the solo years, gave away to other artists. And, some of those songs, people don't really think of all the time, like, David Bromberg doing the song he wrote with George called "The Hold Up."
Yep.
You know, you don't hear that much, and I don't think it's on people's consciousness that much. So even though we don't play the music, which is kind of a frustration due to the digital millennium whatever act, we feel that we can point people in the direction of things they can look up on Spotify or whatever. And so we try to come up with either someone to talk to, or a record to review, or a theme of some kind to do with helping people navigate the back catalogs of these guys.
Right. So what sort of research do you do for the show then, leading up to it?
Well, obviously, depending what the topic is, if we have to read the books that we are going to talk to people about it, or as much of them as we can, depending how far in advance we've scheduled the interview, and come up with questions based on that, because we do it as sort of a round robin, each ask a few questions and then on to the next guy, and then sometimes we'll have a second round, so we have to have questions. If it's about the music, we'll look up what we can if we feel that we don't, that we need a refresher of some kind. And obviously listen to the music. If there are multiple versions or outtakes, I'll always listen to all of that. Just so that we can offer some depth, so that it's not just us, bloviating about, a couple of tracks here and there. We want to give some information, and we want to give some reason why we're expressing the opinions we're expressing, pretty much like I would do in a review. So basically like that, don't know what else to say about it. It just sort of, in a way, stands to reason, but now we're doing them every 2 weeks instead of every week, so we have a little more time to do the prep. And I always feel that when we have time, the more time we have to do the prep, the better the show ends up, because we have the background we feel we need, even if it isn't all expressed out loud. You sort of know why you think the things you think, and you have the sort of confidence to stand behind it.
Okay, so what sort of advice would you give to people if they wanted to do a podcast themselves?
Okay, it varies. I mean, there's some technical advice I would give, which is get yourself a good microphone, and a pair of headphones, and be able to monitor. We've had some shows early on that just sounded not great, and make sure you turn off your phone. When we interviewed Peter Jackson, we interviewed Peter Jackson, and he had said, no time limit, guys, anything you want to do, because he really is a big Beatles fan.
Yeah.
And he spoke to us for 4 hours. I kept thinking, we should let him go, but whenever I thought that, he would start a new topic, but someone, and I think it was someone working in his office who was just sort of monitoring the podcast, but wasn't on screen, I think had a phone on. And so you'd hear it ding every time there was an email, so I would recommend, for people who want to do podcasts, some of that technical stuff that you don't initially think of, make a list about anything you find annoying in podcasts that you've heard, and find ways around it. And one of them is making sure the phones are off, or you go on your computer and you go into the settings and you turn off all system sounds, so that if your computer gets an email, it doesn't ding. That's taken us a while to get to, I mean, now I think we're doing pretty well, but otherwise, come up with a name that you feel people will remember. Our podcast is now video, although there's also an audio version that, just the soundtrack of the video that goes out, and a lot of people still just listen to it on audio. But if you can do video, I think it's sometimes helpful to see people. or, the stuff that, Ken is always holding up the things he's having in his, contests and things, or I can have my book sitting here, on the screen. So I would recommend thinking about video podcasts because it does seem to be the way of the future. I completely resisted it when Ken wanted to do it, but now I'm really happy that we do it that way, except for one thing.
Okay.
I do the video editing.
Right.
And, I'm a pretty good audio editor. I mean, I'd always, back in school, did electronic music and stuff like that. I know how to edit a tape, or these days a waveform. I'm really good at it. Video is a lot harder. You make a cut, there's going to be a jump. You got to put a dissolve in there, something like that. So I would recommend, for someone who wants to get into this, to think about getting a good program that is flexible to let you do, what you want to do, make a professional looking or sounding product. But otherwise, have something to say. And if you're about to start a podcast, I would say, map out 10 or 15 weeks worth of topics before you even get started, and then add to them as you're going on so that you don't run out, because, that's one of the big sort of terrifying things. What do you do from week to week? We don't have that much planned in advance. We have things planned in advance if we know there are going to be particular releases that will, schedule themselves.
Yep.
But if there's nothing coming out and we have to come up with a topic like songs the Beatles gave away to other artists, it takes some discussion between us. And usually we'll do that discussion, after the podcast is over, while we're still connected on Zoom. We'll discuss possible ideas, and then we'll take it to email and just email each other during the 2-week period, and hope that, we come up with an idea far enough in advance that we can use most of the 2 weeks to do the prep. And if not, we're not people don't necessarily expect to hear us on Monday nights or something. So if we don't have it and we need a little more time to finish reading the book or doing the listening or whatever we need, we can schedule it on a different night, Especially now I'm not out reviewing. It used to be when I started this, I was still at the Times and I was out reviewing really most nights. And it became very difficult if we couldn't do the podcast on the night it was originally scheduled for. It didn't mean I was necessarily available the next night or the night after. So, but now, now I'm up in Maine, not reviewing concerts. And so I can pretty much do it any time, apart from that I should be writing volume 2.
Volume 2. Yeah.
So, yeah, is there anything you think I've left out, since you also are an experienced podcaster?
I don't know, but I will tell you a story that I think you'll find amusing. I don't know whether you know about this, but I was speaking with Stu Arrowsmith, who does the Elvis Costello podcast, Dangerous Amusements. And we were doing a show and we were doing it over video. So he was able to, we were talking about, the famous, writing that he did with Elvis Costello, that Paul McCartney did with Elvis Costello. And then I pulled out, because I've got it down there, the deluxe set of Flowers in the Dirt, which has got, the demos on it. And then Stu can see me pulling it out and he says, oh, look, he says, that's what, £150 worth of McCartney and Costello. And I'm there going, I'm glad we were on headphones and my other half can't hear you saying this. And then he says, oh, sorry, £25 will buy you.
Yeah. Yeah, there is that. You're saying a lot of stuff on podcasts that you have to be sure that what you're saying you don't mind anybody hearing.
And for anybody listening, my other half absolutely howled with laughter when I played that to her. She thought it was hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. People sort of expect wives to really, crack down on you about your collecting things and stuff, and mine doesn't, So I don't know. When I can't remember what it was. It was some pricey thing was coming out, and one of the other guys was saying, well, so, does your wife know you're getting this? And I said, all I need to do is say that something is coming out, and she'll say, you should get that. So I don't know, maybe women are, generally speaking, getting a bad rap on this collecting thing.
That's true. And I was only doing it for the humor anyway. But without the video element, that joke would not have worked.
Right. Yeah.
It's those moments that are pure gold. Anyway, where can people find you and get hold of you, Allan?
Easiest way to find me is on Facebook, and there are two me's on Facebook. There's me and him. No, there's just plain Allan Kozinn, and I have another one called Allan Kozinn Remixed. That was actually started by my wife because she wanted to start a page for Got That Something, How the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and you need to have a profile to start a page from, and so I decided to keep it, and Remixed would be my alter ego, and I suppose mostly Beatles stuff on that side, and the plain Allan Kozinn one is more classical stuff when I was doing more of it anyway. But also, if people want to contact me about Things We Said Today has an email address for all three of us, which is Things We Said Today radio show @gmail.com. So I don't know, weirdly Germanic long name, Things We Said Today radio show, all one word, @gmail.com. But that was set up in the Steve Marinucci days. He set that one up. So we've never changed it.
And then there's a fantastic website for the McCartney Legacy as well, isn't there?
Right, there is. I think it's just called McCartneyLegacy.com.
Anyway, you can find Pods Like Us on any streaming network, and we are on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and thank you, Allan, for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Martin, for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I enjoyed it.
Me too. So thank you, everybody, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us.